This is the oldest bell at Mission Santa Inés. It's called the San Juan Baptistas bell. It's dated 1806, but the records show it as 1804. Probably they felt that it was with the original mission when it started in 1804. The bell was in the top loft, the top opening of the three openings, the records show. You'll notice it's a children's bell. At the missions, there was three types of bells. First type was one that hung off of a bar where the Indians, neophytes, would pull the bell by pulling a rope off of the clapper to ring it. The second type was this type where the children would ring it by swinging the bell in a circle. That meant that the wood, the yoke, had to be the same weight as the bell, so that the children could get the bell swinging in the full circle. This would weigh the same, and it would operate in a balance off of this point. The three bells in the tower at Mission Santa Inés were all children's bells. The third was the more modern approach, and that's where you have a wheel on the side where the bell would swing back and forth. We had one bell that was called the St. Agnes bell, you'll see, that was set up as a swing bell. But this is the oldest bell, 1806, in the original tower, marked though as 1804. Many times the dates represented the date of casting or the date of order. This bell has a normal crown. Some of the bells have a crown at the top that is a royal crown that represents a gift from the bishop. We'll see that later. This is the original yoke that was with the bell. So this yoke is from 1804, 1806. So it's one of our oldest wood oak yokes. Second bell in the museum is the Manuel Vargas 1817 bell. The records indicate that this bell was at Mission La Purísima originally and then brought to Mission Santa Inés. It's a children's bell. You can see that the weight of the top equals the weight of the bell, balanced on this point. This is sort of a traveling bell in the sense that originally it was La Purísima, it came here, it was put in the tower, probably hung in the back side or could have hung in the front side, but when the bell tower fell in the heavy rainstorms in 1911, it was in the pile of rubble of the adobe, and when Father Buckler went out to look at the bell tower, later he found out this bell was missing, was not out there. They found it in Santa Inés on the highway. Someone had stole it, put it on their cart, their wagon, and it fell off, or the wagon couldn't carry it, or something happened. It was found in the middle of the road, so it came back to the mission. So it's been traveling around. It's a small bell. It's one of the smallest bells, and it's from Lima, Peru. 1817, a number of bells were cast after the earthquake of 1813. A number of bells were damaged in that earthquake, so a large order was put on the ship for Lima, Peru, and then later a big order of bells came back to California from Lima, Peru, from Vargas, who cast all the bells for a number of the missions. It tells the story of how we bought, at the missions here, bought a number of items, not from Mexico, but from countries like Peru, because ships couldn't travel down the coast from Mexico to California. They could travel out into the ocean and then back to South America much easier than they could go from California to Mexico. So this was cast in not Mexico, but Peru. The third bell in the museum is the largest. It's the Ave Maria Vargas bell, 1818. It was part of the ships of bells brought up after the earthquake. This is not part of the bell. If you see this in the museum, this is from the St. Agnes bell, which is now in the entrance sign as you come into the mission. This is a children's bell. This belongs originally to La Purísima mission. Was brought over here for safekeeping, was kept in the bell tower that fell in 1911. So this is a children's bell, original yoke, rang by swinging completely around. It's cracked completely from this point all the way down, almost like the Liberty Bell. In the history of the mission, we've gone through cycles of how you preserve, how you take care of bells. Originally, you preserved bells by taking the bell out, molding it, and recasting it, taking the metal, melting it, recasting it. And that's what happened to the bell in the top tower. Top niche in the tower was recast. Then we went through the next cycle where we took and we replaced the bells. And that's where we took the bells out, brought them here to the museum, put in new bells. And what they do now for preservation is they take the bells out, put them in the museum. They'll take a mold of this bell and then take a sampling of the type of metal and then cast a separate bell that will sound like and be a duplicate of this bell to be placed in the tower. La Purísima at one time asked me if they thought they'd ever have a chance of having this bell moved back to La Purísima, but it's technically, officially, Mission Santa Inés because it did hang in our tower last. But La Purísima would, if they wanted to, historically to put this back in their bell tower, would take a mold of this, cast a duplicate of this bell, and then put this bell back in their tower, a duplicate copy of the bell. So that's how they're substituting bells now, is by making copies of the bells that sound like, made of the same material. So this is another La Purísima bell. Center bell still has to be rang by hand. King Warwick is showing us now how the upper bell is rang by a chain. If you look inside, you can see the arch, the filled-in arch, where the third bell arch was originally under Father Butler's bell tower. Okay. The bell niche closest to the church has the newer bell, 1984, the St. Francis bell, that's rung completely by a motor for swing bell and a clapper on the right for tolling. The St. Francis bell is dedicated to Father Cyril, pastor in 1984. We'll see the other niche is the Santa Inés bell. Both of these bells were donated in loving memory of Ray Connors, Jr. on May 22nd, 1984. They were for the repose of the souls of Francis Connors, Hazel Connors, and Ray Connors. The bells match the style bell and the material used in the bell tower at UC Santa Barbara. It was cast at the same time that they were doing their bells in their new bell tower in Santa Barbara. It's the Santa Inés bell. It's again donated by the Connors in 1984. It's totally automatic. It's run by a computer, so it's set by timing. The motor runs a swing operation, and on the left side is the striker for a toll mode, where you can just hear the sound of the bell at particular increments. The bells were cast in St. Louis, Missouri.
You are now looking at the cemetery from another perspective, and that is from the bell tower. Looking down to the cemetery gives us a very beautiful and a very organized overall picture of the Mission Santa Inés Cemetery.
For a number of years, the St. Agnes bell was this niche right here. Originally, it was bought by Father Butler for the new bell tower, but when the bell tower was converted back to 3 arches, the St. Agnes bell was placed right here in this niche, and a striker was designed to ring it manually by a button inside the church, but it never really worked. So the St. Agnes bell is set here until it was relocated into the entry sign at the beginning as you come into the front driveway of church.
Before we get into the church proper itself, we've located ourselves in the choir loft of the Mission Church. And just to get an overall picture and idea of what the entire structure within the church looks like, we do get a shot of the walls and of the different artwork that is part of the mission decorations. Of course, the major part of it, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, has to do with the rear dose, or the rear wall, and the entire sanctuary of the Mission Church. Also, you will notice that by comparison with other pictures, which we will be showing later, you will see the new additions and the updating of the artwork within the church, which was accomplished in 2006, beginning in the month of August. By the time that this work is completed in the church, the pews will also have been changed, and the floors will have been repaired, and the church will resume somewhat what we hope to be somewhat similar, although not totally exactly in concordance with what the designs were in the original mission church. However, the sanctuary itself, which will remain untouched, is the original painting done on the reredos and the side walls, and was completed in 1822. Okay. We're still in the choir loft, and we'll just take a real quick look around the area of the choir loft. You can see the restored work, which is dating here to 2002. Also, we draw your attention to the window at the end of the church. The glass work and screen work, of course, is not original. There have probably been at least 4 sets of windows in the church over the time. And before that, the Padres in their time probably did not have the use of glass, and as a consequence, most likely used shutters to close the windows. But the windows that we see here and the looking at the style are carpenter shop windows, which probably date to 1950, 1955. As I move this direction here, we'll be going back to something that we talked about earlier, and that was the catwalk that extended between the church itself and the bell tower. This stair leads us up to the area of the bell tower. And although we can't get into the bell tower at this present time, this passageway leads out into the bell tower. And when we come back to this area, we will take a look at the area where the deterioration took place. However, the area that we're standing on right now, the floor and everything, is not part of the original mission. This entire area had to be taken down and reconstructed because of the dry rot and various other things that had deteriorated not only the floor but the beams underneath. So it was a very fortunate accident that old John had in the choir loft in the bell tower in falling out, because it was required engineers come in and take a look and found that this choir loft was structurally unsound. And as the present time now, everything is totally new in this area, and it is probably more secure than any other part of the mission buildings. Walking over to this area here, we see a door which leads into the convento of the mission, and we'll be taking a look at that before we leave this study of the mission. The door itself is not an original, but it is the entrance to the choir loft, and it is the entrance by which the students from the seminary came to perform the divine office and to attend Mass. The students did not attend Mass or do any of their religious services in the church itself. They did them in the choir loft. After you went out this door, there was a stairway that took them down into the garden and out to the seminary that we spoke of earlier in this review. If you'll notice in the ceiling there is what appears to be a hanging light. This is incorrectly hung, however, but there are a number of this particular designs in the museum of this particular type of bowl. It was used for a chandelier. This one has been used with a red lamp, and evidently with the idea that it was going to be used as a sanctuary lamp. The only lamp in the church that is allowed to be of this particular color is the sanctuary lamp. So this is merely a place to display a part of the history, but all through the different rooms throughout the mission, this type of chandelier, which burned candles, was used to light the rooms. This one has been restored and painted up, but not in a historical way. But I don't know who did these colors. They may be very original, I don't know. But anyway, we have a number of these throughout the mission, and mostly in the museum, and some in the archives that give us an interpretation of the type of lighting that the Padres used in the mission. We'll stay here at the rear of the mission church for a few moments and get an overall picture of what this church or chapel is really like. As we look forward towards the altar of the church, we're going to see the most outstanding part of this chapel, and that is what is called the reredos, or the rear or sanctuary wall. It is on this wall are the original paintings of the Chumash Indians, which were placed on the walls of on the altar walls in the church of 1817. Going back a little bit, in the earthquake of 1812, this church was completely destroyed by the earthquake, right down to the very foundations, and consequently had to be rebuilt again and was totally finished in 1817 and was rededicated on July 4th, 1817. At that particular time, the reredos, which we are now looking at, is not the reredos that was in the new church of 1817. It was a much milder form of decoration, and we'll see samples of it a little later when we get into the sanctuary. The walls that we are looking at right now were redone and completed in 1822. As we look up towards the ceiling, we are again going to see the massive beams that stretch their way across between the walls of the church. Actually, all the mission churches, the width of the mission churches is totally dependent on the availability of the large timbers that could be gathered in the area around the mission. In our case, the beams are made from sugar pine, which grew on Figueroa Mountain, and were cut and drugged down here by the Chumash, and they were hewn until they were in the form that we now see them, including the corbels, and were raised. So that we have this church, which is about 30 foot wide, and that is the best of the beams that they could glean from the forests on the mountain. Each beam in the church, much like the beams in the sanctuary, were decorated originally with a leafy or vine form, but in 1974 it was found that some of these beams were becoming weak. 2 of them had to be replaced. The others needed support, and consequently on the face of each one of these beams, a giant 2x16 was placed on either side of the beam with large bolts going through, and thereby the original beams were strengthened and will be supportive for many years to come. The corbels were not done at that particular time, except for the 2 beams that were placed. Those corbels were also in particularly bad shape and were replaced. As we look towards the floor, we are going to see not so much at this place, but the floors that are in this church are actually the original floors dating to the church of 1817. They have not been touched since then. They do show some wear and abuse by just the constant use of almost 200 years of foot traffic. As we look through the church also, we're going to see a set of pews that are not part of the mission period. Pews were not used in the original mission churches. There were no seats at all. When one was attending religious services, they either stood, knelt, or sat on the floors. On the walls of the church, we can see different forms of art. Some is statuary, some is in pictures. Along the walls, we can see a series of 14 pictures, 7 on each side, which are the stations of the cross. Above each station is also a cross, which is originally the marker for the station itself, and the picture was only a reminder of what happened at that particular station. The stations of the cross depict the last days of our Lord Jesus Christ on the earth when he was condemned to death by Pilate and was taken out to Calvary, where he was crucified and died and was buried. The stations that we see on the wall at the present time, the artwork is original. They date to the middle 17th century. They were painted specifically for this mission. and were brought up here by ship after the mission was built. They have been restored at least twice in that period of time, once sometime in the early 40s, and again in 1974, in 1984, a major restoration of the artwork in these stations was done. It was completed by 1994, and the stations have not been touched since then, except for the fact that the original frames, the frames which dated to 1954, were removed, and a little bit more conforming type of frame was put on the various stations. Along the side walls also we will see various brackets on which are statues. In the rear are two sets of crucifixes, one, and they are all polychrome, finished paint artwork, but one is merely the crucifixion. The one on the right side is also a crucifixion scene, but it also depicts the two thieves that were crucified with Christ at the time of his crucifixion. On the center wall is a statue of St. Jude on the left, and on the right side is a statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Neither of these are mission historical statues, but have been placed here in the church. There is a picture of St. Paul that goes in place of St. Jude, but at the present time is being restored and will be returned probably in 2007. As we turn to our right, we are going to see a very unusual area. And at the present time, it is now a shrine dedicated to St. Anthony de Padua. And this area was originally the mortuary, that is the place where the body of at that time, the Chumash were brought to the church at the time they had passed away. The body was laid out in this mortuary in preparation for the funeral requiem mass, and then was brought into the cemetery. This archway also opened out into the cemetery, which is on the same side of the church that we are looking at the present time. After the damage to the north wall of the church during the floods of 1910, this doorway was blocked up and the area was closed off. For a number of years after that, baptisms took place in this niche. The baptistry table and water was in this area. But historically, it is not the baptismal area. We will see that at a later time. But in 2006, the baptistry was restored to its original place, and the statue of St. Anthony was placed in this area that we call the Mission Mortuary. We're now looking at the area from which we have just come, and we're going to move towards the cemetery side, mortuary side of the church. And this photograph is actually one of the first photographs that will be taken of the relocation of the baptistry to its original spot here in the Mission Church. There is a historical and a religious significance to the artwork that surrounds this particular statue. It involves the sacrament of baptism. According to Catholic teaching, baptism is the time at which the sin of Adam and Eve was removed. And if we will historically look into to the Bible and the story of Adam and Eve, we will see that in that story it speaks about the Eve eating of the forbidden fruit and thereby being punished by being driven out of the Garden of Eden. When Christ came, he established the sacrament of baptism, which involved the pouring of water to remove the original sin from human beings, and also the ascent or descent of the Holy Spirit upon the person who was being baptized. And as we look up the columns towards the peak of the archway, the significance of this of the vine that goes up there is supposed to represent the tree of life, of good and evil, of which Eve ate the forbidden fruit. At the peak, we see the descending of the Holy Spirit down upon the person that was baptized. So originally, this was the baptistry of the original Mission Church. The significance of the artwork surrounding it, although not really authentic, does reflect the the idea of baptism. The artistry that was originally there was a little bit more specific. There was a little bit more of the tree form to the vines that were present there. At the top of it was a little bit more crude and more native type of a dove, which reflected the Holy Spirit. And also up there were also two very outlined figures which represented Adam and Eve. We're now looking at the beams in the sanctuary. As we spoke before, I was telling you that the beams were restructured in 1978 and 74 to 78. In the sanctuary, the beams were decorated. However, when the new faceplates were put on the beams, we did not go back to the original artwork, primarily because of the complications of it. But however, the original artwork is beneath the plates that go across the beams. And at any time historically, if they wanted to be researched, the beam could be removed. However, we do have excellent pictures of the beams in their original state with their original decorations. The corbels, however, do have the original design, and they have not been changed. The stencils that were used to paint the present artwork on the beams are now stored in the archives of the mission. We're looking at the present time, work going on in the 2006 restoration work here at the Old Mission. You can get a good shot of the wainscot, marbleized wainscot, but primarily right now we can see the repair that is being done to the floor for the small pock marks, and the large holes are being repaired. The floor is then being sealed with a plastic stain, and over that plastic stain is going to be placed a very thick coat of wax to preserve the floor from any future damage. Most of the damage to this floor was done by the pews, which had been moved at one time and not put back in the proper place, and as a result they moved around and wore holes in the floor itself. Today is November 20th, 2006, and this section of the video is an appendix to the videos that we have taken before this. This is the day when the new pews were brought to the Mission Church and are about to be, or are being assembled right here in the church itself. They replaced the pews, as you will recall from our earlier pictures of the church, that over half of the pews that were in the church, they were all identical, but over half of them were made after 1974. The other half were made approximately in 1954. But the pews, all the pews matched. They had nothing to do with the historical aspects of the Mission Church in any size, shape, or form. So we have an opportunity here to see what the church would look like in the early times at Pumavit when there were no pews in the church whatsoever. We're going to go up to the front now and take another look at the installation of the pews, and after that we'll take some shots of the men assembling the pews right here in the church. At present, we're viewing the assembly of one of the pews. They came in about 6 parts: the ends, the backs, and the seat part, plus the holders for the missalettes. They should be installed in the next 2 days. The entire church should be completed at that time. And at that time, we will take some shots of the church in the completed form. We're now at the presently at the front of the church, in the niche in which we have the shrine of Our Lady of the Rosary. The opening that you see here, the archway, is actually another door to the cemetery, and likewise, in the same manner as happened in the at rear opening to the cemetery, the decay of the adobe block became so bad that it was necessary to block up and to fill in any opening that there were on that particular side. And at that also at that time when this was blocked up, there was created here a temporary side altar at which an extra mass could be said if there was a visiting priest. Later on, that altar was removed as a mass altar, and there was a shrine to Our Lady of the Rosary. Originally, Our Lady of the Rosary was located also at the same area that we looked at and which we saw St. Anthony. However, after about 1912, somewhere in that area, maybe 1920, the statue of Our Lady of the Rosary was moved to this particular position. The statue that we see here at the present time is not the original Our Lady of the Rosary. At present, it is being restored by Alejandro Reyes and should be back before the beginning of 2007. At the time, at a certain period in time in 1980, the fancy pedestal, etc., was laid out for the statue itself in the form of what were all the mission altars are in this curved shape, but on a much larger basis. We used the design of the mission altars to also form the pedestal on which we put Our Lady of the Rosary. As we look to my left, we are going to look at a statue which is called Ecce Homo. It is one of our most, picture rather, it is one of our most valuable pieces of art here at the mission. It depicts Christ when he was brought before the crowd by Pontius Pilate, and Pilate said, "Behold the man." In Latin, that is ecce homo. It is quite dark. It has been restored in 1998, and it was in much worse condition than it is now. However, even after restoration, it is still quite dark. As we move to my left now, or towards the sanctuary, we are going to take a look at two pieces of mission art, both ecce homo and the picture we are now looking at are mid-17th century artwork. What we here have in this particular picture is called the Nativity of our Lord, the Adoration of the Angels. It is a oil on canvas, and as I said, dating to the mid-17th century. And to the left of the nativity scene is a crucifix of carved wood crucifix, which dates to the early 18th century. And it is of a particularly fine hand-carved artwork. We do not know too much about it, except that it most likely was carved in Mexico, at Mexico City, at the seminary or the university there, and was brought here and given to the mission at the time of its founding. Of particular note on this crucifix is the very short corpus on the crucifix itself. The body of Christ is much shorter than you would see in proportion to the size of the crucifix. Also the straightness of the arm. So it is in many ways, a rather crude wood carving, but it is well done. It was recently preserved by Paul Malakon here at the member of the parish, and the wood preservative put on it. As we look down from the nativity scene in the floor of the church, we will see on both sides of the church, on either side of the altar, here before you enter the sanctuary, is the burial site of 5 of the padres who served the mission between 1804 and 1850. They actually served as the pastors or as administrators here at the mission during the real actual mission period, and were laid to waste here in the early or front part of the sanctuary. We are looking at the marker on the right-hand side of the church. As we move across the center of the church, I will try to draw your attention to the second marker, which also contains the remains of 2 of the padres that served this mission. It is interesting to note that on this side is Father Antonio Calzada. He was the first pastor, the founding pastor of Mission Santa Inés. He died just before Christmas in 1814. So he was not able to really serve here at the mission a very long time. But he is because of his place in the establishing of the mission here, there are a number of remembrances of him throughout the valley. For example, going out into Santa Inés, we have Calzada Road, and also going up Alisal Road, the hill that goes up from Mission Drive to up Alisal Road to the top. That hill was originally called Calzada Hill, although it no longer has any specific title except that it's the top of Alisal Road. Officially, it has been named Calzada Hill, and it was from Calzada Hill that the Easter sunrise services always began here in the valley up until just a few years ago. The entire community, Catholic and non-Catholic, would assemble on the top of Alisal Road, Calzada Hill, and with lit candles would proceed down to the Bethania Lutheran Church for the sunrise services honoring the resurrection of Christ. So Calzada is a name that is very famous in the valley, and remembrance of Father is there for all time to come. Also buried with Father Calzada is Father Felipe de la Cuesta. Now, Father Felipe de la Cuesta was actually there are many relatives of Father de la Cuesta still here in the valley. The de la Cuesta Ranch is still out on Ballard Road. These were members of Father de la Cuesta's family that came to the valley during the settler period and received Spanish land grants. In fact, Elenita Merrill is a granddaughter of one of the de la Cuestas, of Sam de la Cuesta. And the Merrill family exists here in the valley in their children under the name of Merrill. Also, two sisters who never married lived out in Buellton for a number of years. Both of them died as it were, as old maids, and so there is no longer left any members of that particular family. But Father de la Cuesta was one of the most two priests here at the mission were very much loved by the Chumash. One was Father de la Cuesta. He learned their language very well. He wrote their dictionary. He gave them a form of written language so that what was once only able to be spoken, he was able to transform into a written language. And so he holds a very high respect as far as the Chumash are here in the valley. And he did very much of the teaching, also of music, to the Chumash who were members of the mission during that period. In the other side that we have just looked at before, there is a gravesite of one also very special Capuchin, or rather Franciscan priest who served here at the mission, and that is Father David Torrio. And he is noteworthy in the mission annals and among the Franciscan histories of Padres as being a very holy and devout person. In fact, in the the biographies of the Padres who served the mission, he has a very special attention paid to him because the annals refer to him as an angel in the flesh. He died here at the mission, a very painful death, evidently. It was some form of very painful cancer. But he served the mission right down to the day of his death, and they said it is said that the young Chumash children would come to his bedside to learn their catechism. As we look at this particular pilaster near the side door entering into the garden of the church, we draw special attention to this pillar because it was above this or along this pillar that the original mission pulpit was located. As you can imagine, to be able to be heard and by the priest, to be by the padre, to hear what he has to say. The church was very big, and that the parishioners, the Chumash, would gather around. But as in many European churches and many early churches before we had microphones, the pulpit was located much further into the nave of the church. And it was along this particular pilaster, and I don't know if the camera will pull it up, but there's a little rough spot and raises in the altar. There originally were two big beams that came out of the pilaster, and they formed both the copula for the pulpit and down lower the base of the pulpit. And that pulpit remained here until about 1860, on which, when Father Basso was here after the Padres had left the mission, he got up to preach one Sunday and using this pulpit, and the entire pulpit collapsed under his feet, fell directly to the floor, and we are told by, as the story goes, that he was left standing upright on the floor, not quite knowing what had happened. But the pulpit was then removed, and at that time, a side altar, as we spoke of on the other side of the church, a side altar was constructed on this particular site. And that altar remained here until the 50s, when both side altars were removed from the church because they were not needed here or not used to any great purpose. As we look down the church from the front here, we are going to see the result of the very latest in restoration within the Mission Church. This is the year 2006. And we know from antiquity of this church that the walls and pilasters were extremely decorated, much more than you see them now. But up until about 3 or 4 months ago, there were no decorations on the wall. The wall was white, clear from the ceiling to the bottom. But we were able to discover some of the design, or at least approximate some of the design of the original mission church. And consequently, we can see the marbleized effects along the base of the wall. We know that that was a brickish marbleized effect, much like the panels in the sanctuary. And as we have scraped off different parts of the walls, we have found that there was some kind of decoration, mostly vines and flowers, and we have tried to at least summarize in a way or recreate some of that original design. We do know that the area between the ceiling and the first ridge up there was a blue color. We have been able to remove the paint up there over the years, and it was a blue. But at this point in time, we have not chosen to restore that blue at all. But we have used the greens and the reds and yellows that are were part of the original Indian work. Now, as we move from the ceiling and down towards the left side of the church, we are going to look at the door which opens into the mission gardens. This is an original door. We took a look at it from the garden some time ago, but it is original mission door. On the outside is the design of the River of Life. On the inside is just the rare construction part of the door itself. But it is an original mission door, which means it dates to the very latest. It dates to 1817. We're now going to turn our attention to the sanctuary of the mission church. Although the sanctuary is fundamentally the same as it was during the mission period, significant changes have been made, mostly by reason of Vatican II, but fundamentally it is the same. The raised area is part of the mission church. The steps going into the sanctuary are the same, although there was no carpeting. The pulpit on the left is not the original pulpit. It is according to the new liturgy. The platform that we see directly in front of us is also part of the new liturgy. And right at this very moment, we're going to try and draw your attention to the altar as it appearing on your screen at this particular time. This altar has no historical context, except that it is an imitation of the original mission altar, which we're going to take a look at in a few moments. Because the liturgy required the priest to face the front of the church and to face the people, it was necessary to place an altar out from the rear of the church so that the priest would have room to move and to face the people in the offering of the Holy Mass. And consequently, in 1968, somewhat soon after Vatican II, a very simple altar was placed here by Father Camillus, which is a four-legged altar, quite ornate, but in itself very simple. And in 1974, that altar was determined not to be too much in conformity with the mission art and mission architecture, and it was removed, and it can be presently seen at San Lorenzo. But the altar we're looking at right now was built in 1974. The artwork on the front of it, the stigmata of St. Francis, was done by Ray Connors, a local artist here at the church. This altar was decorated by him, but the altar itself was constructed by M.T. Patrick Company, who were doing the major restoration here at the church at that time. But this altar follows the same design as the original altar. And at this moment, we're going to move into the sanctuary and take a look at that original altar, and I'll describe to you what it looked like at at that time. We're now looking at the original altar. It is somewhat complicated to describe exactly the condition or the way the original altar was placed. But before we do that, number one, we have to subtract from this altar both the tabernacle and what we call the steps of the altar. These steps and the tabernacle do not date to the mission period in this particular part of the church. The paneling here on the front of the tabernacle was used on the original church, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But actually the steps and the columns and stuff were part of a altar that we talked about, which was a side altar. And we have a number of pictures where this background for the altar was located. But the original altar, number one, we know this was the front of the altar, so that the priest standing here would have had the altar table in here. But with a closer view, you can see where a platform has been added onto the front of it. And actually, before that, it actually came out about this far so the priest could offer Mass on the table. But in the days of the missions, this was the altar table. None of what you see was here, except a very small tabernacle in the back, which had what we see here, the frontage to the tabernacle, the artwork for the Good Shepherd, which is portrayed here on the door of the tabernacle, and it is original mission artwork and was restored in 1978. The crucifix on top, of course, is an original carving from the mission period. And drawing your attention now to the floor, this is very difficult to really understand, but the platform I'm now stepping onto is part of what would be either the original or identical to the original platform. If moving towards where I'm walking now, if you can picture that there were two more steps, each one down, and then the second step would have taken me down to the level of the floor underneath. So that this entire platform at which we're looking here, except for this area here and two steps here, was not here until probably 1968, at which time this platform was built in order to accommodate the level of the new altar. So according to the old liturgy, there were three steps. There was a platform. The priest came up and offered at this altar the sacrifice of the Mass on a very plain altar cloth table. The platform that was done in 1968 came around on both sides of the altar, but did not include this raised part over here. In 1980 or 1979, this section of the platform was added on this side because Father Jim Cleary had felt that in order to put the priest's chair in a prominent place instead of on the floor, he felt that it would be better to have the priest sit in this particular corner during the recitation of the prayers of Mass before the priest steps the altar. However, this did not work out, mostly because of the pulpit being in the way, and this platform became more or less not usable. But although we do have in this particular corner the original silverwork processional cross and candlesticks, which date to the pre-mission period. They are made of Mexican silver, and they were used in processions carried by one altar boy carried the crucifix, and two altar boys carried the candles. And these were used for all processions during rogation days, processions into the church during the mission period, and up to just a few years ago, at which time it was decided to take them out of use because of being so large and unwheelable. They were constantly either falling or being hit on the doorways and were being damaged. And consequently, we have set them up here for public view. Looking here on the back wall, which is the original painting of the church, at least original in as much as it dates to 1822, we find the two candle stands, which are very unique reflecting mirrors behind him. There's quite a story about the use of mirrors in the mission church. In the early period of the missions, mirrors became quite popular. In fact, the mirrors were just about everywhere you looked in the mission churches. And consequently, the head of the Franciscan order felt it necessary to ban the use of mirrors in the church because they did not fit in with the liturgical feel. They were, too, as it were, too modern, too much out of being overdone, and consequently they were banned. But these are remnants of that period, and they were very functional candles because they do reflect the light of the candle and do magnify that light. These candles are used at midnight mass on Christmas, especially when the church is in dark, and it is quite attractive to see this very soft color coming from both of these candles that you see with the angels at their base. Looking at the walls of the church, if we just look to my right, we're going to see some of the artwork on the sides of the sanctuary. Now, it's interesting to note that in this sanctuary, this church was built after the earthquake and completed in 1817. At that time, the sanctuary was decorated and colored, and in the reredos, so both side walls were painted and with elaborate artistic work. But somewhere in the process, whoever was in charge of the mission at that time determined that they were not really happy with the artwork that was on the walls, and as a result, the old artwork was painted over, and what we see here now, the paneling and the flowers and the flower pots, etc., that decorate the side walls and the sanctuary walls were painted over, and this is the artwork that was resulted from it. But in a few moments we're going to take a look, because we do have a few spots where this has chipped off, this later painting, and has chipped off, and we do get an idea of some of the coloring that was design that was here in the sanctuary in the first painting of the sanctuary. That first painting was done in 1817, but we were told by Father Engelhardt the new painting was completed here in the church by 1822. We'll go back to the painting of the sanctuary, but I'm going to draw your attention now to the statue of St. Agnes, which is high above the altar. And we're now looking at St. Agnes Santa Inés, who is a patron saint of this particular mission. All the missions were named after a particular saint. A great number of them were named after women saints. St. Agnes is a young girl, 14 years old, who was martyred in around 300 by the Romans during one of the persecutions, and was a very popular saint all through the very early ages of the church, through the Middle Ages, and even down into the early parts of this century. She's depicted holding the palm in her hand, and in her arm is a lamb. And it is from the lamb that she actually gets her name. The Latin form of lamb is Agnus. The Spanish form of lamb is Ynez. So we have the Spanish form Santa Inés, the Latin form Sancta Agnus, and the English interpretation Saint Agnes. So this statue was restored in 1999 and at a great expense, and now takes its place above the main altar. There's an interesting, she's had an interesting history. She had been restored about 3 times over the years. In 1950 she was restored, and before that she was also restored sometime in the late 30s. What had happened during the time of Father Buckler, before the windows were able to be put into the church, quite often owls would get into the church during the night. Well, on one particular occasion, an owl was spotted and having sitting on the arm of, or the shoulder of St. Agnes. And for some particular reason, one of the people living here spotted that owl and proceeded to take a shotgun and to shoot the owl. But of course, in the process with the buckshot, they really did a lot of damage to the statue. But it was restored later on, and the buckshot were removed and patched over. But over the years, this statue has been restored a number of times, and the job we have done this particular time is quite well done and very historical. We've been speaking about the painting here in the sanctuary, and that the painting that existed here dates to 1822. But there are certain areas in which gives us a very good insight into what was on this sanctuary wall before 1822. We know this church dates to 1817, and we do know from historical records that the sanctuary was painted, but we don't really know what it totally looked like. But as areas have changed through chipping, etc., we begin to see some of the colors from the old painting here on the wall. For example, we can see part of a red band and some other colors that come kind of in there. Also over in here we can see the same thing. So there was some form of red band around here, perhaps a cinnabar color. The same thing over along the wall in this direction here. We have a repeat of that. And most interesting enough, though, is actually on the back side of the pilaster, which is pretty hard to see at the present time, but behind this conduit that has been placed in there is some of the original artwork. There are pinks and reds and yellows in that, but they have to be examined very closely. But from a historical point of view, we can track down some of the coloring that was used here in the sanctuary. The later restoration of the sanctuary, which was really not a restoration of the sanctuary, took place in 1978. And at that time, the colors and the walls were cleaned to somewhat degree. We can see in this particular panel, the white is very clean. We were able to clean that up. But there are other areas which are darker and seem to be less bright. And that was the entire plan was to clean the entire sanctuary and to brighten the colors. However, having started with all the work that had been done here and started on these panels, it was discovered that we could not financially move any further than we had done. So as a result, we stopped at this particular point. So some of the panels are cleaned and they more or less brightened up to their original appearance. Others are still quite dark. For example, in this area here, this panel was not able to be cleaned down in here, although we can see where they began to do some of the cleanup work above that. This work was done in 1978, done during the pastorate of Father Roger Anderson. But it is interesting to note because Father Anderson was quite sick at that particular time. He had a number of heart problems. And it was during the period when we were getting ready to do this painting that he again had a heart problem. And Father James Johnson was sent here to oversee the work and to oversee the parish, and it was under his guidance that this work was done. He was somewhat of an artist in his own shape, so it was very fortunate that he was here at that time because he was able to work very closely with the artists in the work and to keep a strong hand on the artists as they worked here in the sanctuary to restore it. So he does have a part in the restoration of the mission, and he should be mentioned for the efforts and the care that he took at that particular time. Before we leave the sanctuary, I want to draw your attention to this particular piece that's set up here and displayed in the sanctuary. The frontal part of this statue, of this piece of artwork is not really an artwork, but it is one of the pillars that went to make up the original communion rail. As you know, each church until the new liturgy came in had a communion rail, and it was at that place where people received Holy Communion. That communion rail, I will explain in a moment, was gradually disappeared, and a new communion rail was built, but these are the panels from the original communion rail. We'll now go to the entrance to the sanctuary so we can see where the original communion rail was. I'm standing now in the approximate location of the communion rail, which dated back to the mission period. There were a number of communion rails over the years, probably at least 3 communion rails that extended along here, but they all had the same basic design of what we were just talking about a few minutes. So as a person came up to communion clear into the 60s, they approached the communion rail, they stepped up on this first step and knelt up on the top. The communion rail was along here, so they had one step down. But the communion rail extended clear across the sanctuary. It was in the center that there was a gate. Many of the old pictures of the mission do show the original and the later date communion rails. To my right now we are looking at what is called the lectern. It's from this that the sacred scriptures are read and the sermon is preached. This was built by Joe Zandonati, one of the workers here at the mission, and there were actually 2 of them. There is only one now. The other is turned into the pedestal for the Lady of the Rosary. But this is the pulpit. As you can see, it's based on the design of the original altar, which we have tried to maintain the original feeling of the mission period by using the designs that are found here from the original church. For a moment, I'd like to describe to you something that is very unique about Mission Santa Inés. Each Capuchin priest that has come here to serve as the pastor of the mission, to their tribute, has left a remarkable legacy behind them. And at this moment, I'd like to talk about one of the very different legacies that Father Tim O'Sullivan left here. This church, being an old building of the type that it is, can become very cold in the winter. Although in the summertime, because of the thickness of the walls and adobe, etc., it is quite cool in here. But during the winter, it had become extremely cold. And it's such a big building with such high ceilings that it was really not realistic just to put in some kind of furnaces or something like that in here, much less to try and install some kind of forced heating. So Father Tim was able to discover a gentleman who did radiant heating. And having analyzed the building, he decided that this church could be very well heated by a radiant system which would be built into the floor. And so in 1954-55, under the guidance of Father Tim, a heating system, radiant heating system, was installed here in the floors of the mission church. We do not know the exact design in the floor, but we do know that a number of tiles had to be removed so that the copper lines could be installed that would do the heating of the church. The beauty of this system was that the heat originated at the ground level and rose towards the ceiling, as all heat does. And as a result, with the heating system going, the people in the pews did receive the warmth that came out of this heating system. But as far as we know, the heating system ran in a zigzag form up and down the church. The pumps and the heaters that influence this system are located in the attic, and we'll be taking a look at that area at a later time. But on a cold morning, you can come in here and if you just take your hand and put it on the floor, you're going to find that it is very warm. So that is one of the things that made a positive contribution to the comfort level here at this old mission. I am standing in the sanctuary at the entrance to the sacristy door. This door was most likely built is not an original door. We don't know the history of it, but it probably was built during the time of Father Buckler or Father Tim. It's very difficult to tell. It's a fairly simple door, and all the mission doors we do know that were original do in some way reflect what we call the river of life. And wherever we find doors that is not present, it is an assumption that they were not historical doors, but were built and added at a later date. So now we'll go on into the sacristy and take a look at some of the original artwork that is in this area. This is a service area. Sacristy is used for many different things. It was larger at an early date. Some of it went on beyond the area that we'll be entering, but at the present time, because of the numbers of vestments and candles and things that are necessary, it is a very crowded area. But we do have some of the original art and other items that are of interest as far as the history of Mission Santa Inés is concerned. As you enter in, you will notice that the floor changes to a red concrete. This concrete was added by Father Tim at the same time the heating system was put in the floor. There is a radiant heating system in the church and the sanctuary and also in the sacristy here. When they got to putting down the heating system in the floor here, the floor in the sacristy was in a very bad state of decay, and after the heating system was laid, it was found necessary to just pour a concrete 3-inch slab over the top. But Father, in order to keep just the plainness out of it, did add a red color to the concrete. We'll now go into the sacristy. As we enter the sacristy, you will notice directly to the right the design, the original painting designs from the Indian period of the mission, and you will notice the type of structure we will see at different places in the mission and in this room. But it's quite interesting because in this particular area, we do have also a remnant of a former design that was used here in the mission. When we were in the sanctuary, we talked about the reredos or the paneling on the back of the church dating to 1822. But before that, there was, as we said, there was a painting on the sanctuary walls that the padres were not pleased with, and as a result, they were painted out, and the present reredos of the church was painted on. But in this room, we do have a remnant of the earlier paintings that was on the wall during the mission period, the period when this was found to be an unsatisfactory design, and the present design that we see here. Now, the green part has been touched up by Mr. Paul Killian when he did the Madonna Chapel, but as you can see, here are the original mission colors in here. The original flower design circulars extend all along here. The border and some of the black has been restored. This little, as it were, wainscot surrounded this entire room, and it also is on this side of the doorway also. This has all been touched up. The green has been touched up. The balance remains the same as it was in 1822. As we look around this room, we'll first of all draw your attention to the ceiling. The ceiling on this is the original ceiling of the mission church. The planks, the beams, and the corbels are all original nature, as is also the walls. The only part that is new, as we spoke a few minutes ago, is the floor. As we look towards the ceiling, you will also notice hanging on two walls are two restored paintings. As you look at this particular picture, it is entitled Jesus at the Well. It's the painting of the story of Jesus who met the woman at the well in Samaria. And this picture was restored in 2004 in preparation as part of our celebration for the 200th anniversary of the Old Mission. As we look to our left and over the door, you're going to see another painting which has not been restored at this particular time, but it depicts an ancient Christian tradition about Veronica and the veil. As you The story is that Jesus, on his way to Calvary, was confronted by this woman who offered her veil to wipe the blood and sweat from his face, and as a reward for this, the imprint of his face is left on his veil. There does exist a veil in France, which is claimed to be this original, what is called Veronica's veil. At a later date, we intend to have this particular painting restored. On the other wall to the left is another picture, which was done in 2004 for a presentation in preparation for our 2000th anniversary, and is hanging here in the sacristy at the present time. And that is when Jesus, the story of Jesus when he was in the boat with the apostles, and the storm came up and he was sleeping, and the apostles are crying to Jesus to wake him up and to say, please save us, we're going to sink. While we're looking at this picture, and we move a little bit above it, we notice the corbels that support these beams. Now, it is commonly thought that the corbel has this particular design because of the necessity to tie the beams across the ceiling and to keep them in place. And the tradition says that on these corbels, behind the little notch about halfway down the corbel, that through that area and across the beam were tied leather straps, which replaced the use of nails, which were not very common in the construction work in the early missions. The use of leather to tie wood together was a common practice. We're now going to begin a different section of the mission itself, namely some of the rooms inside the mission, both on the lower floors and on the upper floors. As I approach this door, this is the door that opens into the priest's kitchen and the dining room. This door was the only access to the dining room and to the kitchen before 1968. Well, we are now in the priest's kitchen. What you are looking at is a kitchen that dates to 1974, which was a part of the reconstruction work here at the mission done by M.T. Patrick Company under the guidance of Monsignor Hawks and Father Roger Anderson. The kitchen that existed here before was a very primitive type kitchen. The ceilings alone, these are drop ceilings with fluorescent lightings in them. Before this ceiling was put in here, the original beams, the big beams that are roughly 12 by 16, formed part of the roof together with the planking. The kitchen was very crude. There was a simple gas stove which stood here against this wall, and there was also a sink that we see. The counter is all new, of Spanish tile. As when I walk over here to where there are some chairs where the priests are able to eat at least breakfast and their own lunch. This area did not exist before because in this corner here were the washer and dryer. So it was quite interesting in here sometime if the washing was being done and it was also lunch or dinner time, one had to overcome the sound of the going washer and the dryers. This was a very primitive kitchen, as I said before, and it was a very difficult type of room for the brothers that served the padres here to prepare meals properly and also to allow the priests to entertain occasionally. When we leave this room, we're going to turn around and walk in this direction, and we will come into what is now the priest's dining room itself, which is an improvement on the early dining room. We are now in the priest's dining room. This room, much like the kitchen, was of a very rustic nature. The ceiling was not of the type that you see here now with the beams. It was much more open and rustic. There was a simple table in here with about 4 chairs. There were no closets for glassware or dishes or anything of that particular nature. It was quite stark, and I suppose at that time much fit into the lifestyle style of the Capuchin order. As we look in this direction here, going past the kitchen door, we are going to see an addition that was made here in the time of Father Kelly, which saved a lot of walking in order to come to the kitchen and the dining room, both for the priests when they were eating and also for the brothers when they were preparing meals. As I said before, the only way to get to the kitchen from the other parts of the building was to walk along a corridor outside, come in the kitchen door, and here was the kitchen and here was the dining room. So that it was a long way, number one, from the priest's quarters to this area. It was also a very uncomfortable way in the cold weather, in the inclement weather. However, in approximately 1965, through the generosity of a man named Galvin, who owned the San Fernando Rey Ranch, an Australian who was extremely rich, his generosity allowed a stairway to be brought down here from the second floor to the first floor. I am now standing at the base of the stairway, which will lead us to the second floor. We will be going up there in just a few moments. But you can see that this stairway, which was within the building, made easy access to the kitchen compared to the way it was in the earlier days. So somewhere in that period of 1965, through the generosity of Mr. Galvin, as I said, this stairway plus other furnishings in the upstairs living quarters of the priests were able to be improved and made more comfortable.